now.
Right.
Okay. Well, this week and next week is kind of a special set of things that we're doing. And I did an intro last week, which everybody was there for. Uh, but I just kind of wanted to touch base a little bit about why we're doing this again, for Rick's benefit, and kind of go into this. On the 17th of this month, it will be the 230, 36, 236th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution. And so it's a really kind of a special, unique time in which we can look at two founding documents. As this past July 4th, we celebrated the passage of the Declaration of Independence and the ordering of it being engrossed. And so this week, we're going to take a look at the Declaration of Independence. And next week, we're going to take a look at the Constitution. I asked everybody to think about three things as they read these documents. And just as a preface, I'm not going to go into politics at all with these two documents. I think looking at them as they are without any political slants, any interpretive models, and all that is really important, because the big thing is let's know what's in them so that whenever anyone has a conversation, they're able to say, oh, I know what's in there, or I know what that is. So I asked everybody to look at, or ask themselves three things. First, what was in there that surprised them and that they didn't know before, but is in there, and it's like, oh, wow, I never knew that was there. Second, what didn't surprise them about the document as they were reading it? And then finally, is President Oaks, the first presidency, gave a talk about 3 years ago, in which he said that pieces of the Constitution, and by extension, the Declaration of Independence, were divinely inspired.
Mhm.
And so my question was, what pieces do you think, in looking at those documents as a whole, were divinely inspired? And there's no right or wrong answer to any of those questions. It's simply, let's all take a look and dig a little deeper into our knowledge base. Now, part of the reason that this is important is that in 1976, on the 200, or looking towards the 200th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, in Miami, an experiment was done because it was becoming more and more apparent that many people were not really aware of what was in our founding documents, whether it be the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, or the Constitution. And so they made a typewritten copy of the Declaration of Independence and randomly went around into different areas of Miami and all that, and randomly asked 50 people if they would read the document, and then if they liked it, if they'd be willing to sign it, without telling them what it was. They got a grand total of 2 people that were willing to sign it. And there were common refrains like, oh, I don't believe in any of this stuff and all this. My favorite, in a horrifying way, but my favorite was a store clerk was asked. He said, well, I like it. I'd be willing to sign it, but my boss wouldn't like it, and he doesn't really go for this commie crowd. And it shows that even as far back as 1976, more and more people simply did not know what was in these documents.
Could they even phantom it?
Pardon, I couldn't hear you.
Could they even understand it back then?
That's maybe part of it. Some of the language is a little bit arcane,
A little
but
bit?
but it's not bad in terms of that. But let's take a look at the document itself, and there's a great image of it right here. I'm going to share just real quick.
In fact, we had somebody else join us.
That's Anna Marie.
What was that?
Oh, good to see you, sweetie.
But there, right there, is a copy of the engrossed Declaration of Independence on parchment with all 56 signatures. The first 50 signatures were done on August 2nd and 3rd of 1776. And over the course of several years, 6 more people signed it.
Beautiful
And
handwriting. Beautiful.
yes, that was professionally done. Documents like that, government documents and so forth, were handed to professional um, uh, writers, and it's called engrossing. Basically, writing it out in a very legible form, usually quite beautiful like this, on parchment or sheepskin. And this is the document itself. As you can see, very short, not massive or lengthy. It's not like a book length diatribe against everything, but it gets the point across. To give an idea of how special this was, when Thomas Jefferson passed away, he had written up or drawn his the cenotaph for his grave, kind of an oblong obelisk of sorts, and what was going to be written on it. And one of the things he put on there was author of the Declaration of Independence. He was very proud of that accomplishment. And in a way, it was very special for that time period because there were so many potential divisions between the colonies that could have occurred and erupted. Now, it wasn't just Thomas Jefferson that was involved in the writing of it. There was a committee of 5 people. Benjamin Franklin and John Adams were of course on there. I believe Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston were the other 2. Now, there's no records of the committee meeting together and what they did and all that, but the standard understanding of it is that they all said Thomas Jefferson should pretty much write out a draft, and probably based on some conversations. Now, this draft is important because it was altered later on when it came to finally approving the whole thing. And this is where we start to get into a look of what is in there and what isn't. So my first question is, for those that have read it, what surprised you about it?
Did you read it this week, Rick?
Oh, as busy as I've been.
Yeah, he was as busy as I was. Our neighborhood was crazy this week. Plus, he worked a couple days.
All I've been doing is looking for keys.
Okay, Shirley, it's up to you. Did you read it?
I skimmed through it, but I noticed that one of the signers, John Hancock, was the only one from Massachusetts. He was the only person from that particular colonial state. And I thought, gee, all of these other places have all these different signatures on it. And there's just that lonely person, only single person.
Well, now under mine,
yeah.
Well, under mine, Shirley, there's several of them from Massachusetts.
Well, maybe, wait a minute.
John Hancock,
Well, I
Samuel
wonder if
Adams.
it has Massachusetts John Hancock by itself. Then when I flipped the page over, Samuel Adams and John Adams were part of Massachusetts too. And I thought, oh, that's weird. But the other thing too was, I guess, by the time that what was it, 1820, they were saying that the parchment was already starting to disintegrate. So
Yes.
they had John Quincy Adams had commissioned a printer by the name of William Stone, who made a full-size copper plate of the Declaration.
Hmm.
I thought that was quite interesting.
Yes. Also, something interesting, just as a sideline to that, when the Declaration was ordered engrossed, they also ordered 13 other copies made on parchment, so that one copy each could be sent to each colonial legislature.
Mhm.
And I don't know exactly how many survive to this day, but one of them is at Knott's Berry Farm in California.
Wow.
There is a replica of the um, Independence Hall at Knott's Berry Farms,
Mhm.
and in their little museum piece, they have one of those copies,
That's
or at least
right,
they
I've been
did
there.
30 years ago.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And so it's really kind of a neat thing. And you have to understand, at that time, we didn't have the television, the instantaneous news, and all that. A lot of these things, it was disseminated by newspaper articles. And at that time, committees of correspondence were writing this stuff out and sending it to their other corresponding members in other states. And so uh, it was slow to get there, but newspapers, uh, generally those that could avoid being uh, put under observation by the British, would print copies of it. Also, George Washington ordered the Declaration of Independence to be read out to the soldiers and giving them a better idea of what they were fighting for. But in terms of myself, what I find surprising in the document, it's not so much what I didn't know was there, because I've read it many times over the years, I've taught it. But I always come away amazed with the fact that there was so much in there that really jabbed a spear, so to speak, at the side of the king. Because even at that time, there were a significant number of people that were very reluctant to break away from England.
Mhm.
As I was talking last week, it's similar to the idea of Civis Romanus. I am a citizen of Rome. Back in the Roman Empire and Roman Republic days. Well, for 18th century North America and Europe, if you said you were a citizen of the British Empire or of Britain, it like opened the doors. I mean, it was very, very important. And so they had to be very careful. And so I'm always amazed at that, where instead of really poking the bear with respect to Parliament, House of Commons, House of Lords, and so forth, they went directly after the king.
Yeah, it's very obvious when you look at it. He
That's
has
right.
done this. He has
That's
done
right.
this.
Mhm.
Yeah, it isn't they.
Yeah. Now, in a very early draft, Jefferson also poked the bear by being very accusatory that the king had essentially brought in slaves to be sold or allowed the institution to happen. Jefferson always called slavery the peculiar institution. Now, slavery has a very long history, both in a more benign sense as well as very harsh sense. But Jefferson understood that somewhere along the line, it was going to become more trouble than it was worth. Even though at that time the South relied heavily for their economy on slavery. And so the early draft accused the king of allowing this institution to take root and develop, and it's more on the slave trade that the draft was accusatory of. But the members of the committee realized very quickly that if they put that in there, the southern colonies would say, no, we're not going to approve this.
Yeah.
And so that was taken out. But you'll notice in there that they refer to the Indians as savages and so forth. And so they're perfectly willing to, in an early draft, to take out the issue of slavery, but they leave in this idea that Indians are savages, and I always just like, wow, okay, we've got the temperament set up for the Trail of Tears, for example, and the different Indian wars in the aftermath of the Civil War and the westward migration of the white population. And so uh, in there are some very interesting things, important things. In terms of what I already knew was in there, pretty much the whole thing I was very familiar with. And so I always come back to what surprises me. And I think this document gives us a real picture into the mindset of those who finally, after giving it all their best to try and resolve the differences with England, said, we've got to do this. We've got to break away.
Mm-hmm.
But we've also got to make a statement behind it. Otherwise, there's no chance that we will get people to really back us because there's no set of principles. And so I always go back to the opening two paragraphs. And if we take a quick look at those paragraphs, you'll notice it talks about unalienable rights,
Mm-hmm.
but it also talks about a time in which throwing off the bonds of your country, your leaders, becomes necessary or justified, rather. And that is very, very important. Let me see.
Yeah, in fact, I've got that paragraph.
Pardon?
I said that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the
Yes.
right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such a form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Yeah.
Yes.
He's laying it right out.
Right. But look at that opening paragraph. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation.
Yeah.
So right away, it starts out by saying, okay, here's why we're spelling this out. There has to be some justification for what we're doing. We can't just say, okay, we're separate. Bye.
Yeah, we're leaving. Yeah.
It's not going to work. One, at that time, if I remember the figures right for 1776, they were lucky if they could count at about 50% that supported the idea of separating from England.
Well, I think a lot of them rightly feared it.
That's right. They did.
Feared it. Yeah.
I mean, at that time, England was the mightiest naval force and foot military force in the world.
Yeah.
And they're like, we're going to take them on? No way. It's just not going to happen. So, and then by the end of the war, fully a quarter of the people in the country still supported Great Britain. And so it was a big step, and so they had to have something solid behind it. But you'll notice the first two paragraphs talk about why they're separating, but also justifying the action itself
Mm-hmm.
and what people are entitled to. It's only after that that they go into what has been done to them that led them to this course.
Led up to it, right?
And so it's a very beautifully structured document that gives us a real sense of what the thinking was at that time. Now, as with all events in history, actions and reactions are always open to interpretation. I'm trained as an historian that when you look at an historical event, as you're analyzing it, you assume that the people on both sides made the best decisions they could with the information they had at hand.
Mm-hmm.
And so that allows you to be objective. So if you go to England and you take a look at what the information was going to the king at that time by his ministers and advisors and so forth, the odds are those ministers were saying, look, these people are rebelling against you. And they were not so far removed from the ideal of the divine right of kings. Now, it was pretty much removed after James II had been forced from the throne in 1688. And so they didn't really argue all of that. But that feeling was still there. I mean, because you look at the modern coronation ceremony, and one of the titles of the king is Defender of the Faith. And so there's a very big element of God and the protection and the legitimacy of a position under God inherent in a monarchy, especially in England and especially in the 18th century, where they weren't so far removed from that divine right piece. And so if a king is told, your subjects are challenging your authority and what you have done, that king is probably going to say, oh, no, 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 no.
That's not going to happen.
This is not going to happen. The governments in England at that time, starting with Walpole in 1720, was a prime ministerial form. At that time, it was called the first minister. And it was known as that until the late 19th century, early 20th century. Then it became prime minister. All the way up through Lord North, William Pitt the Elder, and others during this time. They basically ran the show. And to this day, it's the same way. A prime minister is the head of government, not the king. They're the head of state. In the US, we have a combined office, a president that's both the head of government and the head of state. So in England, it's separate. And in England, it had been separate essentially since 1720, when Henry Walpole had been the first, what we recognize as a prime minister. And so the ministers of the crown were going to be the ones advising him, but they were also members of parliament. Now it becomes even more complicated because if the members of parliament were the ones passing the laws that in the 1760s and early 1770s the colonies were so overwrought about, there is no way they're going to bow down to the colonists and say, okay, we were wrong. It's just not going to happen.
They're not going to lose their station.
That's right. That's right. And so, in a lot of ways, the Declaration of Independence, the way it was done, and the language within it really presents a full-blown dressing down of not just the king, but the entire government structure in England and what they caused to happen, both the parliament, the ministers of the crown, and then by extension, the king. And it's very important to realize that as you're looking at that document. In a way, it becomes a very important primer for why certain things in our current constitution came about. But just looking at it from the perspective of 1776, it's very important to understand that they were basically dressing down the entire British government in a very, very direct manner.
In a very dangerous manner.
Oh yeah, Benjamin Franklin had it absolutely right when they were signing, or they were trying to get people to sign it. He said, "We all need to hang together, or we will most
We'll
assuredly
all hang.
separately."
Yes.
And that's important to realize that because by every measure of international law, then and now, they were committing treason. So their only hope to avoid the hangman's noose were the colonies to actually win the war. Because by international law, that document meant nothing until the actual peace treaty that granted the independence according to law was signed in 1783. And that was the Treaty of Paris of 1783. And so it was a very dangerous thing. But let's take a look at the final thing I asked you all to look for. And that was, where do we see the divinely inspired elements? I think in terms of the structure of the document, that in itself was divinely inspired because it was so perfectly done on that. But in terms of specific pieces, I think it really boils down to those two opening paragraphs because it sets it right there. Look at those words, endowed by their creator. That specific word, endowed, at least within our faith, the LDS faith, that's very important.
Yep.
The idea of a creator that essentially has granted us rights and liberties. And also the word unalienable. That's a very important word that many people they know it's there, but they don't really look at the significance of it. And in a way, it kind of ties in with Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract, where he said that a society has all of the rights and liberties available to it. But in order for stability and progress, the citizenry give up certain rights in order to have that structure and stability and forward progress as a society. So that the Constitution, when it talks about endowed by their creator with unalienable rights, it fits in with an understanding of Rousseau. Because Rousseau said, just because we voluntarily give up certain rights and liberties in order to have a balanced working society, it doesn't mean that they don't exist and that we cannot take them back if necessary.
And we think for ourselves.
That's right.
In order to do
That's
that.
right. But it's always assumed that it's within the structural allowances of law to make those changes and bring them back. And so I think it's very important to realize those opening paragraphs lay out the divinely inspired pieces in there.
You would almost think that he had been through the temple ceremony.
In a way, you could say that.
Yeah, because a lot of that endowment is these same things.
Yeah.
If God has given us these certain special things, has allowed us to choose for ourselves, has given us the right to think for ourselves, choose for ourselves, and to act for ourselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the thing that's really important about Jefferson is he was a thinker. I mean, he was a scientist. He was an agriculturalist. I mean, he was a classic Renaissance man where every subject interested him. But he also was a deep thinker. One of the things that he did was he cut out the things in the Bible that were the most important to him and put them together in a booklet that's known as Jefferson's Bible. And he would read that because he felt that that gave him the essence of what he needed to know from God.
Same thing with us memorizing scriptures that we like.
That's right. That's right. So right there, I think in terms of his well-rounded knowledge base, not just about law, but also about the world itself, about agriculture, about design and architecture and society, and all that. In a way, it could be said that God prepared him for that role, a very important and unique role. And you look at the reverence that's always given towards that document. I could make the argument that the people that sign that document and they look at the adoration that we give to it, the level of adoration that we give to it today, they're like spinning their grins like, what on earth? I mean, we were doing our jobs. I mean, we were doing what had to be done. Nothing special, nothing to see here, just here it is. And a historian named Pauline Maier, she passed away a few years ago. She wrote a book about that, about the Declaration of Independence, its origins and the process and all that. And she made that argument as well, saying that it's perfectly great that we have some reverence and awe for that document, but we're a little bit over the top. But putting all that aside, it's a really amazing document. We look at it as one of the 3 or 4 principled documents in the American pantheon. You've got the Mayflower Compact, which it doesn't really say much, but what it does say presents the kernel of the idea. And then you've got the Declaration of Independence. Then you've got the U.S. Constitution. And then you have the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, and some others. But within the top 3, guaranteed, you're going to have the Declaration of Independence on anybody's list. And so this is a very special time because we are coming up on the 250th anniversary of that document in just 3 short years, a little less than 3 years now. And amazingly enough, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died July 4th, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the approval and acceptance of that document.
Oh.
And it's kind of interesting. Their friendship had been severed for about 10 years, from 1801 to 1811, and then they started their correspondence again. The last thing that that Adams said was at least Jefferson still lives, but because of the communications were so slow at that time, he didn't know that Jefferson had died just a few hours before.
Huh.
So very, very interesting history, but the document itself is something worthy of a serious read and some real thought and contemplation. But what's really important is that people realize that the basic perceptual elements of it really apply to this day. Now, I'm not talking about revolution or anything like that, but some of the more divine elements behind it. That there is a certain natural law aspect to our lives. Now, that's just my own personal opinion. I know others can have different points of view, but that's where I come out and why I think it's so important to really be aware of and contemplate these documents.
Rufus is here to give his opinion.
Yeah, he talked about
Sorry, they're used to his yellow tail going back and forth.
So, any comments?
I'm going to read it thoroughly. Now that I've just sat here and thumbed through it, yep, I better read the thing in its entirety.
Yes.
Okay.
And I need to get a copy of it. I don't have a copy of it, so I need to get a copy of it.
Oh, you can
Okay.
download it from Google.
Rick
And
has
you
a
can-
copy.
Yeah, I don't have a printer.
Huh?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, the Google is nice enough to write it out in plain English rather than the old English writing, so you can read it and see what it says.
Okay, Rick has a comment.
Yes.
Go for it.
with in the beginning when we talked about when you talked about all the things that were put into the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution early on, and with King George early on, and there is hints not of revolution, but of great change.
Yes.
But those people could not see in the future, and yet they did have the future in mind,
Yes.
because it points out of why Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. It was the only way, and he could do it, save the Union.
Yes. That you're getting into an area that legal scholar, I'm talking scholars, not just everyday reading, where legal scholars will parse the language quite a bit. And one of the things that's done in the Constitution, and we can get into this next week as well, is where is a certain restriction placed?
Don't yell fire in a crowded room.
Yeah. But where is the restriction placed? Where it says that the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended. I can't remember the exact wording. The whole thing is it can be suspended, but the big question is who can suspend it? Well, the restriction on it not being able to be taken away, thus implying only certain groups or individuals could take it away, is found in the first article of the Constitution, which is Congress, not Article 2, which is the president. And so a big question did arise as to whether or not Abraham Lincoln violated the habeas corpus clause by doing it unilaterally. Now, no one argues and no one tries to make the argument that he wasn't trying to prevent a major problem of Maryland seceding from the Union, because that would have put the nation's capital dead center between two Confederate states, and that wouldn't work out too well. So no one tries to argue that we don't understand. But there was a case called Ex parte Merriman in the circuit court where Chief Justice Roger B. Taney on circuit was presented this case. A man named Merriman was arrested by the U.S. military and was being held. And he sued out a writ of habeas corpus in the circuit court. And Roger Taney said the president does not have the authority to do this on his own. He has to have Congress's approval. And wrote out a lengthy opinion called Ex parte Merriman in 1861, telling the president that you can't do this, and the guy's to be released. Well, Lincoln ordered the general officer who was in charge of the fort where this guy was being held, you will do no such thing. You will ignore this opinion. And so it's always been a very touchy situation about where certain restrictions are and certain grants of power are within the Constitution, within those first three articles. Article 1 deals with Congress. Article 2 deals with the president. Article 3 deals with the judiciary. And so I've always found that one to be very fascinating, especially because after the Civil War in 1866, in a case called Ex parte Milligan, the Supreme Court ruled in an opinion by Justice David Davis, an appointee of Lincoln, that when the civil courts are open, civilian detainees in the military cannot be tried by military commission. They have to be brought before the civil courts, which would seem just by a backhanded way of saying Taney was right in Merriman. That this is a no-go territory type of a deal, because Lincoln ordered the military to exercise the detentions, and therefore any habeas corpus petitions would be sued out against the U.S. military. And by extension, Abraham Lincoln as commander-in-chief of the military, which raises its own set of issues that I'm not going to go into.
Well, now you want to talk about if it's divine, you know, the spirit of what was going on during this writing, even though there is questionable things ahead, that's what amazes me about the Constitution,
Yes.
the Declaration, the Articles, is that the spirit was there, even though those guys didn't get it at first.
That's right. And
but Abraham Lincoln worked in that area of the spirit of the law.
Yes, he did, very much so. Lincoln would have approved very highly of a comment by Justice Robert Jackson in 1949 in a concurring opinion in the case of Terminiero versus Chicago, in which he said, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. And what he was basically meaning was that in times of real emergency, government officials that at any other time would not be able to get away with this can do or exercise certain powers. And it doesn't mean they won't be held to account later on, whether through an impeachment or being voted out of office, or even more after office being taken to court. But at that moment in time, the courts are not going to interfere unless it's just so far out of bounds, there's no question about it. And so I think what you're talking about in terms of divinely doing that, they knew that this had to be something that could succeed. And so they wrote it deliberately vague. They didn't discuss all the different things that could be in there. And that leaves the interpretive models that are out there really ripe for a lot of differing points of view. Whether you're a conservative or a liberal or a moderate, there are interpretive modes of interpretation that, even though I may disagree with one or the other type of interpretive model and so forth, it doesn't take away from their legitimacy.
Yeah.
And so it's a beautiful document that I think was divinely inspired on that set of ideas alone. That here it is, over 200 years later in terms of the Constitution, and it's still going strong.
It's a living document.
Yeah, it is. In that sense, it's a living document. In terms of the specific interpretations, the question mark is where's the start and end point. And Justice Scalia was very fond of saying that the Constitution is a dead document. I love a dead document, and it will always be a dead document. He wasn't saying because it's worthless. He was saying because he was an original textualist. Hugo Black, as you're referring to, was a literalist. And so even though he was very liberal in most of his judicial philosophy, if it was written in black and white that was very clear, like the First Amendment, which says Congress will make no law, he would literally ask lawyers, excuse me, but are you trying to tell me that the Constitution doesn't mean what it literally says? And imagine being in front of the 9 justices in this day and age where they actually live record on audio the oral arguments. So loads of people are going to hear these arguments. And you're being asked a question like that by a Supreme Court justice.
Well, on the street, the Constitution is making its play. I was a police officer for years.
Uh-huh.
And everything changes when everything is being scrutinized at the moment it is happening.
Yes.
And back then, with those guys under the gun from King George,
uh-huh,
everything was changing, and they were under the gun.
That's right.
And this is the beautiful part. They made good or decisions that served us until now, and then into the future.
And one of the reasons I'm so disappointed now with both of our political parties and the political system is because they don't recognize that even with the differences of opinion and even with a desire to do things differently, the system itself is working the way it was supposed to work. It's supposed to be messy. It's supposed to be ugly at times. Look at the old comparison or the old saying that everybody loves sausage, but they really don't want to know how it's made.
Yeah.
And that goes back to the time when before the FDA and before the different meat packing standards and all that were put in place in the early 20th century. Yeah. And the same thing with law. We all want to have certain laws and so forth made on one side of the aisle or the other, but we really don't want to know how they're made because we'd be utterly horrified at times of the discussions that are taking place.
Yeah.
Behind closed doors. And yet behind closed doors is where all the really good work is done.
Yeah, that's where the work is done.
Yeah. I mean, right now, when they're on camera, and it doesn't matter what political party, the stuff you see on camera, that's the ugly stuff. That's the stuff because they're trying to make the political points or score the political points. But when they're behind closed doors, most of them will say, and they'll be up front. I say, look, I can work with these people because when we're just discussing it mano a mano or however you want to label it, we actually get some things done. Look at, and just using this as one example, Matt Gaetz, very, very conservative congressman from Florida, very heavy Trump supporter, very political. And on the opposite side, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, very, very progressive liberal Democrat. But both of them have a basic fundamental agreement on corruption laws with respect to selling of stock by members of Congress. They want it forbidden. And Matt Gaetz said that while he thinks she's wrong on many things and he disagrees with her on almost everything, he doesn't believe she's corrupt. And that can only come about because when the cameras are off, they're actually talking with each other about things. I remember just a few years before he passed away, Gerald R. Ford, who was the House Minority Leader from about 1964 or 66 to 1973, was asked, what's the difference between Congress then and Congress now? And I have to remember, this is around 2002, 2003. I mean, it was nowhere near as bad or toxic as it is now, but it was still moving in that direction. It was a lot worse than it was when he was in office. And what he said was something very simple. He said, lack of civility. It's that simple.
Yeah.
Because when he was minority leader, he said, yes, we had our fiery disagreements. We go out onto the House floor. Granted, they didn't have C-SPAN at that time, but we go on the House floor, we shout at each other, we get mad at each other. But that very evening, we'd be at the same cocktail parties.
Yeah.
We'd be at the same social set. You look at
the loss of respect for one another.
That's right.
Yeah.
You look at Joe Biden in 1970, December of 72. His wife and daughter, I believe, were killed in a car accident. He had a son that was in the hospital. He had just been elected a member of the U.S. Senate at 35 years old. And he was seriously considering not taking his seat so he could be with his surviving child and take care. I mean, just trying to be the best parent he could. Jesse Helms, ultra conservative from North Carolina, fought many of the culture battles before they were ever really popular to do in terms of the conservative side of the political aisle. Had just been elected to the Senate himself, and he'd met Joe Biden before that accident had happened and liked the guy. And so when he found out what happened, he would go every day to the hospital to where Biden was at with his child to check on him and see how he was doing. And then he heard that Biden was considering not taking his seat. And he went right over. And here's a person, he's like, oh, I can guarantee us at least a shot at another Republican seat. Instead, he goes and says, you can't do that. We need you here. Your constituents are owed your presence there because you will represent them. And it convinced Joe Biden to stay in the U.S. Senate. Now, regardless of what a person thinks about his tenure as vice president and now as president, that was the springboard for his entire political career after that fact. And it came down to Jesse Helms, of all people. We don't see that anymore.
No.
It's sad that we don't, but we don't see that anymore. And even though the founders and the framers expected things to be ugly at times and very divisive at times, I don't think they ever wanted us to get to where we are now, to where we don't have the civility towards each other. And believe me, politically speaking, they could get ugly in the 18th and 19th century. I mean, there was a political advertisement against I believe, if I remember right, it was against Grover Cleveland. And it ran the idea that he was a drunk, a womanizer, and a Roman Catholic. Find women in Romanism. And that, I mean, it was just so blatant. And that's as ugly as we see now at times. Um,
It's almost a cutthroat type of
yes,
attitude now. Yeah.
yes.
And
But
I
back
think
then,
something else.
though, the
I
big
think
thing
something
is,
else.
yes,
Where we're at now and where we were, it'll come around full circle. So I'm not real worried about it.
no,
I don't like it, but I'm not worried about it.
and I'm with you on that. Long term, I'm not overly concerned. We will come around full circle.
I hope so.
Look, we had
Um,
Civil War, World War II, and World War One, World War II, and everybody was and the women's suffrage. It was all out there, and we got through it. We'll get through this.
yes, and we will. I think now this is just me personally, and I'm not making this statement to cast aspersions on any group or any differing political views or whatever. But I did a paper once on what two Supreme Court decisions regarding Richard Nixon did for the presidency. Now, do we ever want to see a former U.S. president or a U.S. president under the gun, legally speaking? No, we don't. But those two Supreme Court decisions helped better define the role of the presidency and where the boundaries are. And so when I look at the two impeachment trials of Donald Trump, the impeachment trial of Bill Clinton, and the indictments that Trump is having to face now in the judiciary. Did I ever want those things in terms of the broad sense of wanting them? No, but I can say that I think in the long run it will be very healthy for us as a country because presidents will know the boundaries. What is too far to go, one way or the other?
And they
And
should be held accountable like
that's
anyone
right.
else if they've pushed the boundary too
That's
far.
right. And that does not have anything to do with the policies they had as a president
Yeah.
or that they advocated for. I mean, if the things that he is indicted for or were impeached for, and I'm an historian, I very carefully sifted through the documentation and the material and so forth. If a Democrat had done that, I would have said, absolutely, you will impeach this person. Even if I totally agreed with his policies, I'd say impeach him. In the aftermath of January 6th, if it had been a Democrat as president that did all of that, and for months before the election itself had actually set the tone of I can only lose if it's rigged, I'd say yes, indict him. If it had been a Democrat, I'd say indict the person, even if I agreed with all their policies, because the one way in which we can hold ourselves as legitimate, both within our own selves and around the world, is holding our leaders accountable.
Yeah.
No one should be able to get a free pass. And but like I said, that's me. Um, I don't cast aspersions on people on differing points of view or different political ideals, but that's where I am at on this. Long term, in the general sense, it's a good thing. But do I want to see it happen to anybody? No.
None of us do.
Yeah. But in a way, it's kind of the beauty of the system set up under the Constitution. Um, so I'm following this very carefully. I read all the court opinions, read all the case material, and I'm like, it's kind of like someone asked me, what do I think about the New York case, for example? And I said, I think it's a stretch because they used federal law violations to enhance state law misdemeanors into felonies. Now, if it had been state law violations that enhanced it to felonies, no problem. But it's a very novel and new setup to try and use federal law violations, which are generally taken care of at the federal level, to enhance state law violations that were only misdemeanors at the state level, but now they're being enhanced into felonies. And so I would say he is probably going to be found guilty on the two federal indictments and the Georgia indictment, but he will be. And but if he's found guilty in New York, it will be reversed on appeal because it's an invalid use of the enhancing statute because they used the wrong laws to enhance it.
I got one other question, and
Sure.
I know I come in here as an interloper tonight, but how much did they glean from the Magna Carta?
Actually, there was a fair amount.
Thank you.
There was a very fair amount. The Magna Carta until the 17th century was not heavily used, but a judge in England named Sir Edward Coke, during the reign of James I, began using the different pieces of the Magna Carta to hold the king to account. And of course, James I was livid, imprisoned the judge. The judge got out, and it set the precedent that you can't do that to judges, or you can't, or there's boundaries on a king even. But it set some philosophical things in motion. John Locke's second treatise on government, for example. Hobbes' Leviathan, another philosophical work on government. Then Jean-Jacques Rousseau later on. But specific pieces, habeas corpus, right there. The idea of a jury of your peers. Now, granted, the Magna Carta was looked at as only protecting essentially those of noble birth and noble standing, like
It was
knights.
one-sided, a little one-sided.
Very one-sided. But Sir Edward Coke started using it in a much broader sense, and we grafted a lot of that basic idea behind it into our conception of government.
I got a lot of questions, you know.
He'll be back next Monday.
Yeah, like the Articles of Confederation, the Iroquois nation.
Yep.
The whole thing is just so interesting. So when we talk about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, it had some divine things going on with these other articles or other documents to help those guys. So
yes,
they just didn't go in this willy-nilly.
No, they did. They put a lot of thought into it.
Mhm.
But they were also, and here was the important thing, they also were willing, when it didn't work, to make alterations to it.
Yeah, back up and take another look.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's something I'm afraid we've lost over time.
Yep.
Because there should be some very obvious things, regardless of your political affiliation, that we should be taking a serious look at in terms of amendments to the Constitution on government authority and power, both for more power in certain respects and less power in other respects, based upon things that have been happening. So next week we will be looking at the Constitution. Please bring questions. What I'd like you to focus on is the main document itself, Articles 1 through 7, and the first 10 amendments. The amendments afterwards are important. I'm not giving them short shrift by any stretch. But like the 11th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and could easily make full term long college courses out of. I mean, very easily. Okay. So I want to focus on the first seven articles, the principal document that was approved in 1787, and the first 10 amendments, which were passed by the states in 1791. And then if after that we want to go into more things on that, or there's time, we're more than able to. But please bring your questions. I think there's always really good questions and all of this. So I really encourage it. But I think this has gone well.
He's not single, but we won't hold it against him.
I'm not what?
You're not single, but we won't hold it against you.
What do you mean single?
We're on a single group meeting.
Oh, I didn't bring my wife.
Well, you can bring her next time.
Well, I knew how interested he is in this kind of stuff, so I thought
I love the Bill of Rights. I
Uh-huh.
lived by them. I had to.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's 20 after 8. I just have one question so that I can better prepare for next week. Did the format for this week work well for everybody?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure so that if there was anything I can do differently to make it better for people, I wanted to hear about it. I'm glad everybody enjoyed it. I love the discussion. Thank you. And I hope everybody has a really good week. It's very nice meeting you, sir, and I hope you're here next week.
Thank you. And the rest of you for putting up with me.
Since we didn't have an opening prayer, we probably better have a closing one.
Let's do, please. Would you offer us one, Carol?
I will. Our Father in heaven, we are so grateful, Father, to be able to gather together and to talk about things that are important to us and to our government, to our country, and to our world. We're grateful, Father, for the freedoms we have to discuss and talk about these things. We're grateful for the technology that allows us to do this face to face. We're grateful, Father, for the gospel in our lives that teaches us truth and teaches us to use our mind and our intellect and to question. But more than that, Father, we're grateful for the fact that we each get to make decisions for ourselves and have the free agency to do so. We pray that each one of us will be safe this week, that we'll enjoy our coming week and look forward to meeting again next Monday night. And we offer this prayer, Father, and our thanks for all the blessings in our lives in the sacred name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
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 Rufus says good night.
Good night, Rufus.
Good night, Rufus. Good night.
Good night,